Right now, a high-stakes confrontation is unfolding between Elon Musk and the most powerful bureaucracy in Europe. Brussels wants compliance. Musk is saying no. The European Commission is tightening legal screws under the Digital Services Act, and Musk is signaling he won't bow. This isn't just about a tech platform. It's about sovereignty, power, and who ultimately controls the digital public square. And the question hanging in the air tonight is simple. Who blinks first? To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back and look at the terrain. The European Union has spent the last 5 years constructing an ambitious regulatory architecture aimed at reining in big tech. At the center of that architecture sits the Digital Services Act, or DSA, passed in 2022 and phased in through 2023 and 2024. Its purpose, officially, is to combat disinformation, illegal content, and systemic risks online. Unofficially, critics argue, it centralizes enormous speech oversight power in Brussels.
Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission since 2019, has made digital regulation a pillar of her political legacy. From antitrust actions against American tech giants to sweeping content moderation mandates, she has positioned the EU as the global rulemaker for the internet age. The message from Brussels has been clear: operate in Europe, and you operate on our terms. Enter Elon Musk. In late 2022, he completed his acquisition of Twitter, later rebranding it as X. Musk framed the takeover as a free speech restoration project. He dissolved internal trust and safety teams, exposed internal moderation debates through the Twitter files, and challenged what he described as collusion between governments and platforms. For his supporters, he became a disruptor confronting entrenched power. For his critics, he became a destabilizing force undermining safeguards. By 2023, the collision course was visible. The EU designated X as a very large online platform, subjecting it to the DSA's strictest oversight. Brussels demanded transparency reports, risk assessments, algorithmic disclosures. Musk publicly criticized European regulators as overreaching and politically biased. And behind closed doors, according to officials cited in European media, discussions grew tense. Then came the triggering moment. The European Commission launched formal proceedings against X, alleging potential breaches of the DSA. Officials claimed the platform failed to adequately counter illegal content and disinformation. They scrutinized the blue-check verification system, suggesting it could mislead users. They demanded internal documents, data access for researchers, and structural changes. Musk's response was not conciliatory. He signaled that X would challenge the EU's interpretation of its obligations. He publicly questioned whether the DSA was compatible with free expression principles. He amplified voices arguing that Brussels was weaponizing regulation to control political narratives. And crucially, he hinted that if compliance required compromising core values, he would consider all options. But that wasn't all. Reports began circulating that internal teams at X were modeling worst-case scenarios: fines that could reach up to 6% of global revenue, potential temporary suspensions, even forced structural changes. Meanwhile, von der Leyen and EU Commissioner Thierry Breton emphasized that the rules apply equally to all. No special treatment, no exemptions. And here's where it gets interesting. Musk did not retreat. Instead, he leaned into the confrontation. He framed it as a battle between centralized bureaucratic authority and open digital discourse. He suggested that the EU's approach risked chilling political speech. He positioned himself not merely as a CEO defending a company, but as an actor in a larger ideological struggle. Immediate reactions were polarized. European officials insisted enforcement was routine, procedural, non-political. Supporters of Musk argued that Brussels was setting a precedent that could expand far beyond X. American lawmakers weighed in, some praising EU efforts to curb misinformation, others warning of transatlantic tension. The first wave of escalation had landed, but the deeper question remained: what is really at stake here? At a structural level, this conflict reflects two competing governance models. The European Union increasingly favors a precautionary regulatory framework. In this model, platforms are responsible not only for removing illegal content, but for proactively mitigating systemic risks. That includes algorithmic amplification, coordinated campaigns, and public health narratives. The United States, by contrast,
has historically relied more heavily on Section 230 protections and a free speech tradition rooted in the First Amendment. Musk's public rhetoric aligns more closely with that American tradition. He argues that open discourse, even messy discourse, is preferable to centralized moderation. But the EU's perspective is shaped by its own history. European policymakers often reference election interference, extremist content, and pandemic misinformation as evidence that self-regulation failed. For them, the DSA is a corrective measure, a necessary evolution. So, what happens when these frameworks collide inside a single platform operating across borders? That's the heart of the tension. X is global. The EU is asserting regional sovereignty over digital space. If Musk complies fully, critics say it sets a precedent for other governments to demand similar concessions. If he resists, he risks fines, legal battles, or operational restrictions within one of the world's largest economic blocs. And here's the strategic layer. Von der Leyen is not just regulating a company, she is reinforcing the EU's identity as a rules-setting superpower. Brussels often lacks unified military strength, but it wields regulatory influence with precision. The so-called Brussels effect describes how EU rules often become de facto global standards because companies prefer uniform compliance over fragmented systems. Musk understands that dynamic. If X concedes too easily, it could embed the EU's speech norms into its global architecture. If it fights, it could trigger a protracted legal and political showdown. And it doesn't stop there.
As the investigation advanced, additional complications emerged. European political parties began debating whether X was amplifying populist and right-leaning movements disproportionately. Civil society groups demanded stricter enforcement. Some advertisers expressed caution, wary of regulatory uncertainty. Meanwhile, Musk used the platform itself to rally public opinion. He posted about free expression. He questioned bureaucratic overreach. He highlighted cases where moderation policies in other contexts appeared inconsistent or politically selective. And it gets worse for Brussels. The more the Commission pressed publicly, the more Musk framed the situation as a democratic accountability issue. He asked why unelected officials in Brussels should determine permissible discourse across sovereign nations. He invoked sovereignty language typically used by national leaders, not corporate executives. But here's where it gets even more layered. Several EU member states are themselves divided on how aggressively to enforce digital regulations. Countries like France and Germany support robust oversight. Others are more cautious about chilling innovation. Behind closed doors, diplomats reportedly debate the balance between protecting citizens and avoiding transatlantic friction. Then came the emotional peak. In a high-profile statement, Musk declared that free speech is the bedrock of democracy and warned against regulatory regimes that tip the scales towards centralized narrative control. European officials responded that the DSA is about safety and accountability, not censorship. The clash became personal. Von der Leyen emphasized that Europe will defend its democratic values. Musk suggested that defending democracy means tolerating dissenting voices. In that moment, the conflict crystallized. It wasn't just compliance paperwork. It was a battle of philosophies. And from the outside, it looked unprecedented. A private platform owner openly challenging the authority of one of the world's largest political unions. We're witnessing something bigger than a regulatory dispute. We're watching the redefinition of digital sovereignty. So what are the implications? In the short term, X faces potential fines and mandated adjustments. It may be required to alter transparency mechanisms, refine risk assessments, or provide greater data access. That is manageable. In the medium term, however, the stakes are strategic. If the EU successfully compels deep structural changes, other jurisdictions could follow. If Musk successfully limits or reshapes enforcement through legal challenge, it could embolden resistance elsewhere. Long-term, this could influence how digital speech is governed globally. Do platforms become quasi-public utilities operating under regional rulebooks, or do they assert a more uniform, speech maximalist approach? There are alternative interpretations. Some analysts argue Musk is overstating the threat to free speech and that compliance with the DSA does not inherently require censorship. Others suggest Brussels is overstating systemic risks to justify expanding oversight authority. What if both sides are partially right? The DSA does not explicitly mandate viewpoint discrimination, but its risk mitigation framework can create incentives for over-removal. Companies facing massive fines may err on the side of caution. That dynamic matters.
And what if this becomes a template? If X were ever to limit certain features in Europe or adjust its global policies to avoid EU penalties, it would signal the power of regional regulation over global platforms. Conversely, if Musk resists and prevails in court, it could recalibrate the EU's confidence in exporting its regulatory model. Meanwhile, other players are watching.
Meta, Google, TikTok, all designated under the DSA, are observing how far Brussels pushes and how Musk responds. National governments are assessing domestic political fallout. American lawmakers are evaluating whether transatlantic digital trade tensions escalate. At the same time, media narratives diverge sharply. Some outlets frame Musk as reckless and destabilizing. Others portray Brussels as technocratic and unaccountable. The public sees fragments. Behind closed doors, negotiations, legal drafts, and strategic messaging continue. And here's the broader pattern. Across the West, we see a recurring theme: populist or anti-establishment figures confronting centralized institutions. Whether in trade, immigration, or digital policy, the tension between national sovereignty and supranational governance is intensifying.
This conflict fits that pattern. Musk, though unelected, adopts the language of sovereignty and decentralization. The EU embodies institutional continuity and regulatory expansion. Both claim to defend democracy. Both claim legitimacy. So what happens next? Several scenarios emerge. 1. X complies substantially, absorbs fines, and the crisis cools. 2. Protracted legal battles redefine aspects of the DSA's enforcement scope. 3. Political backlash within member states pressures Brussels to recalibrate its approach. Wildcards exist. A major election in a key EU state could shift enforcement priorities. A significant content controversy on X could strengthen Brussels' case, or a transatlantic trade dispute could pull digital regulation into a larger geopolitical negotiation. Watch for specific indicators: formal fine announcements, court filings, public statements signaling compromise or escalation, changes in X's European features or policies. Because this story is not static, it is developing in real time. At its core, this is about who writes the rules of the digital age: a billionaire entrepreneur who sees himself as a free speech absolutist, or a supranational bureaucracy determined to shape online behavior through law. For you, the viewer, it matters because digital regulation affects the information ecosystem we all inhabit. It influences what trends, what disappears, what narratives gain traction. So as this confrontation unfolds, ask yourself, is this about safety and accountability, or is it about control and precedent? Elon Musk has said no to Europe's approach. Brussels insists it holds the cards. The growing crisis is not just legal, it is philosophical. And the next chapter may determine not just the future of one platform, but the balance of power between global tech and global governance. Stay focused, stay critical, and watch what happens next.